On a Tuesday morning in September 1993 in Springfield, Massachusetts, a machinist set down a half-finished rifle receiver on a conveyor belt that had stopped moving, and the sound it made, a flat metallic knock against rubber, was the quietest sound the factory had produced in 216 years. And the fluorescent lights above him flickered once, the way they always flickered when a compressor cycled off. But this time the compressor did not cycle back on, and the floor foreman at the far end of the building stood holding a memo. He did not fold, did not pocket, did not read again, because he had already read it 3 times and the words had not changed. And outside, through the tall industrial windows that faced the Connecticut River, the water moved the way it always moved, with complete indifference to the occasion. And around him, the building itself, red brick, 6 stories, the walls radiating a cold that was not the cold of autumn, but the cold of machinery no longer running, the specific chill of iron going still, exhaled in the particular way that large industrial organisms exhale when their function ends, not with drama, not with fire, not with the roar of an enemy at the gates, but with a memo on a clipboard and a belt that had stopped and a man who did not know where to put his hands. And 155 years of continuous federal arms production ended not with an explosion but with paperwork, not with an enemy but with a budget line, not in wartime but in a fiscal quarter, and the building did not tremble, the river did not pause, and the city of Springfield, Massachusetts did not feel the ground shift beneath it, though something had shifted, something that had begun in the 18th century and run through every major American war, and shaped the industrial logic of the modern world had simply and quietly stopped. And to understand how this ended, you have to go back to 1777 and a revolution that had almost run out of guns. The Continental Army was in trouble of a particular kind, not a shortage of men, not a shortage of will, not a shortage of rhetoric about liberty, but a shortage of flintlock muskets, the specific mechanical object upon which every tactical theory of the 18th century depended, because a theory of infantry engagement without a functioning musket in every soldier's hands is not a theory, it is a wish. And the numbers told the story without mercy or qualification. Fewer than 80,000 serviceable muskets in the Army's possession against an enrolled force of more than 200,000 soldiers, which meant that the most powerful political idea in Western history, the American Republic, was guarded by an army where 1 man in 3 had nothing in his hands but intention. And General Henry Knox, who had already proven himself by dragging cannons from Fort Ticonderoga across frozen New England on sleds, in a feat of logistical obsession that still resists calm narration, looked at a map of the Massachusetts interior and chose Springfield. He chose it for the Connecticut River, which moved supplies south toward the coast without requiring roads that didn't yet reliably exist. He chose it for the ridgeline, which kept it distant from British naval raids that had already demonstrated their willingness to burn coastal supply points. He chose it for the geography, not for destiny, and there was nothing in the selection that predicted an empire. It was a pragmatic decision made by a practical man under pressure, a supply depot on a bluff above a river, a place to store things and repair things, and in 1777 that is precisely and only what it was, and they built it to survive a war, and they could not have known it would outlast 12 of them. The depot became permanent the way emergency things do when the emergency never fully resolves, and in 1794, under the new federal government that had emerged from the constitutional negotiations with an appetite for national institutions that could give the Republic a physical form, Springfield Armory was officially established as a national arsenal, staffed and funded, and given the specific mandate to produce weapons for the Republic's defense in perpetuity, and Colonel David Ames arrived as its first superintendent, carrying the particular psychology of a man handed both a mandate and a budget that could not support it without radical efficiency. And what he did next changed the history of manufacturing across the industrial world in ways that no one inside the building recognized for decades. Ames was not a visionary. He was a cost cutter with a deadline. He looked at French military manufacturing methods, which under the influence of Honoré Blanc had developed a rudimentary system of standardized components, and he saw not innovation but necessity. If Springfield's barrels, locks and stocks could be made to identical tolerances, broken muskets could be repaired from a parts bin rather than requiring a full gunsmith's dedicated attention on each individual weapon from scratch, which meant fewer gunsmiths per repair cycle, which meant lower wage overhead, which meant the armory might survive its own budget allocation long enough to justify its existence to the Congress that funded it. And so Ames imposed gauges across every operation. And he built a proof house where every barrel was test-fired before acceptance, a squat brick structure that absorbed the smell of black powder into its walls so completely and so permanently that 30 years later the mortar itself still carried the smell of ignition on damp mornings. And the first Model 1795 musket came off the line in 1795 at an initial rate of roughly 1,000 units per year, a number that climbed steadily toward 10,000 per year by 1810 as the gauges held and the inspectors learned the tolerances and the proof records filled ledger after ledger in the armory's archive. And what Ames had done, without naming it, without theorizing it, without publishing a treatise, was establish interchangeable parts, manufacturing at scale, the foundational logic of the Industrial Revolution. The principle that would, within 50 years, reorganize every factory on Earth, making everything from sewing machines to steam locomotives to pocket watches. And the irony was absolute and irreducible. He was running from bankruptcy and building the future, copying the French to survive and surpassing them without knowing it. And the armory meant to produce guns for one republic ended up teaching the entire industrial world how to make everything, which is the kind of historical joke that becomes visible only a century later, by which point the consequences are too large and too entangled to find funny. The next click came from a man named Thomas Blanchard, who arrived at Building 13 in 1819 with a specific mechanical problem locked in his attention. The gun stock, which required 18 separate hand operations to shape from raw walnut, 16 of them essentially carving passes with different edge tools, 2 of them finishing. And each operation required a skilled worker and a specific hand tool and a trained eye, and the variance between individual stocks was acceptable by the standards of hand craftsmanship, but unacceptable by the systemic logic that Ames had started, and Blanchard solved it with a cam-follower lathe that traced the surface of a master stock, using a rotating wheel, and transmitted those three-dimensional contours to a cutting tool, working simultaneously on raw, blank material, and the sound the machine made was a rhythmic wooden knock against iron, repeating with a mechanical precision that no human hand replicating the same motion could sustain across a full shift. And the patent, filed in 1819 as U.S. Patent number 3304, described a machine that replaced 18 hand operations with a single mechanical pass. And by 1840, Springfield was producing 25,000 rifles per year, not because the workers were faster or more numerous, but because the machine had absorbed the craftsman's knowledge into iron geometry and cam tolerances and rack movement. And Springfield was no longer a workshop staffed by skilled individuals. It was an organism that processed raw material into finished weapons through a sequence of mechanical steps that could be learned in days rather than years, and the gun no longer needed a gunsmith, and the factory had become the craftsman. And what that meant for everything that followed would not be fully understood until the day the factory itself was declared redundant. The Civil War arrived in April 1861 and hit Springfield like a current applied to a machine that had been running below voltage for 15 years, and Superintendent Alexander Dyer, who understood the metabolism of industrial organisms with the fluency of a man who had spent his career inside them, expanded every building, added every shift, drove recruitment through the city and into the surrounding counties. And the workforce grew from roughly 300 workers to more than 3,300 in under 2 years, and the Springfield Model 1861 rifle musket moved through the production lines in volumes that seemed to exceed the physical capacity of the buildings from the outside. 3 barrel bands, .58 caliber, 9 pounds of walnut and forged iron whose oil-rubbed finish smelled of linseed oil for weeks after delivery crates were opened in the field. And by the end of the conflict, more than 800,000 Model 1861s had been produced at Springfield alone, a number that represents 800,000 complete mechanical objects, each one requiring dozens of discrete operations, each one test-fired in the proof house, each one logged and inspected and packed in straw and shipped toward a war that was consuming them faster than any previous American conflict had consumed anything. And payroll ledgers from those years listed names and shift assignments across pages that ran for dozens of entries per day. And War Department procurement contracts described delivery schedules that required every system in the building to run without interruption. And Springfield didn't arm the Union so much as it constituted the Union's industrial spine. And when the war ended, the silence that fell on the production floors was its own kind of shock. The silence of a body that has been running at maximum exertion suddenly told to stop, and Congress cut the budget with the enthusiasm of legislators who have just finished paying for 4 years of maximum expenditure, and the workforce fell to roughly 700 workers by 1870, and the warehouses filled with surplus, and the factory invented its next incarnation. Rather than tooling entirely from scratch for a new weapon, Springfield took the surplus muzzle-loading rifles and redesigned them into breech loaders using a hinged block mechanism that field soldiers could operate with one hand. The trapdoor, named for both its mechanical motion and its psychological quality, the satisfying metallic clack of the block swinging open on its hinge that became the characteristic sound of the frontier army. And the Springfield Model 1873 became the standard service rifle of the American West, with approximately 700,000 trapdoor rifles produced between 1873 and 1893, a number that kept the organism alive through budget cycles that would otherwise have ended it, and the Ordnance Department conversion contract and the coverage in the Army and Navy Journal described it as an elegant solution, and peacetime was the enemy no bullet could stop. But this time the factory had found its workaround through adaptation rather than invention, and the habit of survival through reinvention would sustain it until the moment it couldn't. The Model 1903 Springfield arrived at the turn of the 20th century and became something beyond a weapon. It became a myth object, the rifle that appeared in recruiting posters, in parade photographs, in the memories of men who could recall its specific weight across a shoulder after 40 years of subsequent civilian life. 8.7 pounds of machined steel and American walnut with a 24-inch barrel and a stacking swivel that produced a sound when engaged that veterans described in letters and memoirs, with the specificity of men describing something they had memorized involuntarily. And General William Crozier, Chief of Ordnance, championed Springfield's primacy in procurement arguments with the confidence of a man who believed that American military identity and Springfield Armory were not merely connected but were the same thing expressed in two registers. And approximately 800,000 Model 1903s were produced before the end of World War I, and by 1917 the Armory employed roughly 1,900 workers, and a Scientific American feature from 1916 described the production process as the benchmark of American industrial precision, and War Department procurement files from those years described allocation and delivery schedules that confirmed the Armory's position as the irreplaceable center of the American military manufacturing system. And the rifle had a name and the factory had a myth, and the myth was that Springfield was permanent and irreplaceable, and myths are durable until the moment they become expensive, and then they become liabilities. The armory that John C. Garand walked into in 1919 was running on reputation and very little else because the war had ended, and the surplus warehouses in Building 30 were stacked floor to ceiling with Model 1903 crates packed in Cosmoline preservative with a smell like industrial petroleum mixed with old machinery. A smell that seeped under the warehouse doors and into the corridor and reminded every worker daily that the building was storing rather than producing, and the production floors were quiet in the specific way that large factory spaces are quiet when they are underused. A kind of acoustic emptiness that emphasizes the architecture, the high ceilings and the wide aisles and the rows of idle machinery that look purposeful until you notice they are motionless. And Congress slashed the ordnance budget by roughly 60% between 1920 and 1924, operating in the post-war disarmament mood that followed every major conflict with the predictability of a tide, and the workforce fell to approximately 400 workers, and Garand was one of them, a French-Canadian engineer who had been hired to solve the semi-automatic rifle problem that had resisted solution since the previous century, and he worked at his bench in a half-empty factory on a project that received intermittent funding and consistent skepticism, carrying the specific concentration of a man who has decided that his only protection against the institution dissolving around him is to produce something the institution cannot afford to discard. And the armory was too famous to close and too broke to survive, and for 17 years Garand refined tolerances and tested gas systems and revised the en bloc clip geometry until January 9, 1936, when the Ordnance Department formally adopted the M1 Garand rifle as the standard service weapon of the United States Army, and one man had spent 17 years in a dying factory building the rifle that would save it. The M1 Garand was, by any engineering measure, a weapon that justified the wait. The first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle adopted by any major military force, gas-operated, loaded by an 8-round en-bloc clip, 9.5 pounds with a balance point that experienced shooters described as intuitive, and the detail that entered permanent cultural memory was acoustic. When the last round fired and the bolt locked back, the empty en-bloc clip ejected itself with a sharp, metallic ping unlike any other mechanical sound in the 20th century weapons inventory, a signature so specific that it outlasted the war in the memories of the men who heard it, and U.S. patent 1,944,445 had been filed in 1934 and granted, and General Douglas MacArthur signed the adoption order, and the initial contract was for 80,000 rifles, and Springfield roared back to life with the specific energy of an organism that has been half-starved for nearly 2 decades and has finally been given permission to feed. Then Pearl Harbor, and December 1941, and the factory became something close to a living thing running at its absolute physiological ceiling. 2 full shifts, 7 days per week, every building repurposed, the production line for the M1 Garand requiring 65 individual machining operations per rifle with tolerances held to specifications that Garand himself had set and that the inspection teams enforced without exception, and the floor of the armory vibrated at a specific low frequency from the simultaneous operation of hundreds of lathes running in parallel. A vibration that workers described as feeling through the soles of their boots more than hearing through their ears. And cotton wool ear protection was issued in paper packets at the start of each shift, and the workforce swelled to approximately 13,500 workers across both shifts, and War Production Board allocation records described Springfield as operating at maximum sustainable output, and Springfield produced roughly 3.5 million M1 Garands between 1941 and 1945. Which fed soldiers in North Africa, in Italy, in France, across the Pacific Island campaigns, in every theater the American military entered, and production logs in the National Archives recorded daily output figures that read now like the vital signs of an organism under maximum load. Steady, relentless, the numbers of a factory that had found its purpose and was spending itself completely in pursuit of it. And the factory didn't just arm soldiers, it became the war's heartbeat. And when the war ended, the heartbeat slowed and the new enemy arrived, and this enemy was not foreign, not armed, and carried no rifle at all. Eugene Stoner was an engineer working for Armalite, a small private California company with no government arsenal history, no brick buildings on a river bluff, no legacy workforce, no institutional memory of anything. A clean sheet operation working from different premises entirely. Eugene Stoner was an engineer working for Armalite, a small private California company with no government arsenal history, no brick buildings on a river bluff, no legacy workforce, no institutional memory of anything. A clean sheet operation working from different premises entirely. And in 1957 he demonstrated the AR-15 to Army evaluators, a rifle that weighed 6.5 pounds with furniture made of polymer, and a receiver machined from aluminum alloy, and a cartridge, the 5.56mm, that was smaller and faster and lighter than anything in Springfield's lineage, and General Maxwell Taylor was among those arguing that the infantry soldier of the Cold War era carried too much weight across patrol distances that bore no resemblance to the fixed defensive lines of the European theatre, and Springfield's answer to the new era was the M14, adopted in 1957 and entering Springfield production in 1959, a rifle of genuine and undeniable quality, 10.7 pounds, select fire, machined with the precision that 165 years of accumulated practice could produce. And the M14 was beautiful in the way that fully realized craftsmanship is beautiful. And it was wrong. Wrong for the jungle terrain that the Army was beginning to understand it would be fighting in, wrong for the patrol weight doctrine that was emerging from the counterinsurgency theory the Kennedy-era military was absorbing with increasing urgency, wrong for the philosophy of the war that was coming, and the Army Infantry Board trial report on the AR-15 from 1958 had documented performance figures that were difficult to argue against across the specific conditions the Army was preparing for, and Springfield's identity, armory, heavy, precise, built to last a generation, expressing a philosophy that held that a weapon should outlive the soldier who carried it, was now the enemy of the doctrine survival required, and they had built the perfect rifle for a war that had ended 15 years earlier. Robert McNamara arrived at the Pentagon in 1961 with a systems analysis framework and a tolerance for institutional sentiment that was precisely zero, and his 1964 Department of Defense Manufacturing Review produced findings that treated Springfield Armory as an overhead problem rather than a national symbol, and private contractors could produce comparable weapons at lower unit cost, and the infrastructure that Springfield had accumulated across nearly 2 centuries of continuous operation, the brick buildings, the specialized machinery, the legacy workforce compensation structures, the institutional organization built around permanence rather than flexibility, was reframed from asset to liability in the language of the cost-effectiveness memo. And Springfield was officially designated surplus to requirements in 1967, and the Armory had offered to produce the M16, the Colt-licensed AR-15 with its polymer furniture and stamped components, had offered to learn the new language of the new weapon, and was told that the offer was structurally incoherent, that an institution built around the M1 Garand's 65 machining operations could not efficiently produce a weapon whose entire design philosophy rejected that kind of investment per unit, and the arsenal that had invented modern manufacturing was closed for being irreversibly shaped by it. And the factory that had taught the industrial world how to build things was told it no longer understood how the world wanted things built. April 1st, 1968, and the last lathe powered down with a descending whine that nobody recorded and nobody needed to record because it was just a motor losing speed. And the Cosmoline drums at the loading dock sat sealed and unused with their lids still tight, and approximately 2,500 workers received displacement notices written in the administrative language of a government managing a transition, and 191 years of continuous federal arms production ended on a date that an accountant had identified as the point at which the wind-down costs dropped below the continuation costs, and the Federal Register carried the closure notice in 3 paragraphs of standard regulatory prose, and the Springfield Union newspaper ran the headline above the fold on an April morning when the river was at its spring level and the willows along the bank were just beginning to show green, and the machines were tagged for redistribution to other facilities, or for auction, or for disposal. And the organism that had breathed through 2 world wars and a revolution and a civil war and 17 years of near starvation stopped breathing on a spring Tuesday because the numbers in a column had finally arranged themselves in the configuration a Secretary of Defense had been. The Springfield Armory National Historic Site opened to the public in 1978, administered by the National Park Service. And inside the exhibition cases, a Model 1795 musket sat beside a Model 1861 rifle musket beside an M1 Garand beside an M14. 4 weapons, 170 years of American military manufacturing philosophy, the full arc from hand-filed flintlock to gas-operated semi-automatic, arranged in a row behind glass in a sequence that made the logic look inevitable in retrospect, though at no point along the actual timeline had any of it been inevitable. And the Blanchard lathe, the machine that in 1819 had replaced 18 human operations with 1 mechanical pass and had started the chain of causation that ran through every factory floor in the industrialized world across the following 2 centuries, sat in Building 13 exactly where it had always been, silent, the iron of its frame still carrying the faint smell of the cutting oil that had been worked into its castings across more than 100 years of continuous use. And tourists photographed it without always understanding what they were photographing, which is perhaps appropriate because the people who built the future rarely knew that was what they were doing, and a private company incorporated in Geneseo, Illinois in 1974 began producing civilian rifles for the commercial market under the name Springfield Armory, Inc., and the name that had once meant federal arsenal and national identity and the physical expression of a republic's commitment to its own defense became a trademark on a cardboard box in a retail display case, and the proof house where every barrel had been test-fired since 1794, where the smell of black powder had been absorbed into the brick until the brick itself was an archive of ignition, became a gift shop selling postcards and replica powder horns and a guidebook printed on glossy paper, and the museum holds approximately 800 historic firearms behind its glass. And the Connecticut River still runs below the bluff where Henry Knox stood in 1777, looking for a place to store things, and the river has not changed, and the bluff has not changed, and the brick buildings are still there. And the machinist who set down the half-finished receiver on a stopped belt in September 1993 drove home on a Tuesday morning through a city that was already in the slow process of becoming something other than what it had been, and no barrel would ever be test-fired in the proof house again, and the factory that invented the industrial world and armed every American war and lasted 191 unbroken years made its last thing in 1968, on a Tuesday in the spring when no one was watching.